Welcome back, friends, to another episode of Liminal Phrames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Darren King, also known as ExoAcademian. We hope everyone is having a great time wherever you happen to be and whenever you happen to be listening. It's great to have you joining us in the show. Darren, as we often do at the beginning of these shows, we like to get a little bit of catch up with each other, see what's going on. A lot has been happening in the wider world. A lot has been happening in our personal worlds as well. I recently had a great time stepping outside at night and watching what little bit of the northern lights that I could see. It was really, really cool to catch a glimpse of that. I had never seen them before, so that was quite fascinating. But on top of that amazing event, I've had just a ton of stuff going on with work and family and family moving to town. It's just been super busy. So a good time, a lot going on, but not really time to rest either. So what's been happening with you?
Well, it's been a great time for me too. A lot happening. I've lived in 7 different states, 3 different countries, 2 continents. But I would say where we live in Western North Carolina is like unparalleled. Like the summer beauty is just intense. And of course, so is the autumn beauty when we get all the colors. But when everything sort of springs to life and you have this lush landscape and the hills that come alive, there's nothing like it to get out on my Ninja and just ride and enjoy it, and to just be really, really thankful for where we live in the world. I know some people live in concrete jungles and don't get to see trees and mountains and lakes and things. So I really appreciate that and don't take it for granted. And of course, because I live in a forest, every window I look out of is lit up with the green of just all the lush growth that's happened. And then in terms of some other things happening, I just wrapped up the second offering of the Expanding Awareness course. So that 12-week course just wrapped up last week. Another really great group of people, really rich experience. And a bunch of those people, as well as some people from the first class, are going to be joining me at this retreat that's happening in Idaho coming up in June, in early June. So we're only a few weeks away now. So I'm looking forward to that too, exploring some more beauty in a different part of our country and gathering together in person with a bunch of people. Will be exciting. But yeah, to your point about the Northern Lights, that was a bizarre experience, right? To have been alive for decades and have never seen them, even though I've lived in some pretty northerly latitudes, I had never seen them before. So knowing that I live 10 minutes from the Georgia border and that I'm seeing them lit up first in green and then in that purple kind of color was really, really interesting. And that kind of thing speaks to the times we're living in that are so unusual, right? This unprecedented time is what we keep talking about. And it seems like symbolically and in rich symbolism, we're seeing this actually manifested in the physical world. And that's what it felt like to me. Like we can go back and say, well, the solar flare that happened to interact with our magnetosphere in such a way. All of that's true from one way of looking at it. But I think it's actually also rich in meaning. And I've been exploring on POC and elsewhere this notion of the synchronistic underpinning of reality being about associations of meaning. So I think that event was actually one of those kinds of things and kind of like a signal flare for some really interesting times we're getting ready to go through as a civilization.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Putting kind of your hat on and thinking back to what our ancestors may have thought if they had witnessed something similar, they'd be in complete awe of what was going on in the sky. And it's not that we aren't either. I mean, we've been treated recently to some pretty amazing phenomena in the sky with the solar eclipse and now this aurora. There's a lot of activity happening with our sun, and like you say, we can predict these things. We understand mechanistically how they work, but they affect us on another level beyond just our sort of cognitive awareness of how they work. They affect us at this deeper emotional level, and I think that's something that is something I've come to appreciate more and more as I've gotten older, because when you're growing up and you're being taught about sort of the way that astronomy works and physics works, you kind of reduce everything to, oh, it's just sort of a bunch of equations, how things operate, and you lose touch to a certain degree with how things make you feel. And I for one felt the whole weekend, honestly, really connected and almost like had a heightened sense of awareness that I don't necessarily normally have. And I can't attribute that, I guess I could say I could attribute that to maybe the solar radiation that was happening or what have you. I don't know, but it felt energetically like I was in a different place almost. And then when you step outside and look at the night sky, and it's completely transformed in a way that you're just not accustomed to seeing, it does feel as if you've stepped into an alternate way of being. And I feel like I'm tapping into that in ways that I just haven't before, and it ties very neatly with a lot of the things that we've been discussing, that we just live in this incredibly interesting time, and we're highly connected. Our tensions are also at a breaking point in many ways. Our anxieties are very high. We have a lot to be grateful for and thankful for. We're the benefactors of incredible technology and wealth in the world, just broadly speaking. But it's kind of a powder keg. There's just a lot of energy, jam packed in that space, and we have the sense in which something is somehow going to give. That there are going to be cracks here in this, in this container, and the energy is going to start spilling out. So that's the sense that I have. I know that can sound a little bit daunting or scary, but I think we want to talk to some degree tonight, as we're going to get through the various topics, how we might navigate energies like that. I know you spent a lot of time thinking about that, and of course talking and leading classes about energy and transforming that energy and kind of dealing with it when it comes your way, because it will be coming your way. I think that's safe to say.
Absolutely. Safe to say for sure. And I think, as I said on the recent POC episode, and I've said in some of my classes and whatnot, I think it's important to help people learn how to deal with intense energy and how to handle that, how to sit with it, how to be with it, not to sort of retract away from it, because soon we will not have the option to retract away from it. I think up until now, people have to some degree stayed preoccupied with devices, with streaming shows, with just staying busy, getting ahead with their career and not thinking about these other things going on in the world. But this rising tide of intensity that's expressed in numerous different kinds of phenomena that are co-arising in our time will soon be unavoidable. And then it's just going to be about feeling in every way this really intense energy, and learning how to actually deal with that energy, how to metabolize it, how to transmute it will be incredibly important, probably more important than anything. So yeah, I definitely want to be involved in helping people to do that. Last thing I want to say too about that, in light of what you're saying about the solar flares leading to the northern lights, there's something really unique about light as a carrier wave for not just consciousness, but different kinds of elemental aspects of reality. So we are right now near the solar maximum in terms of how much light's coming from the sun. That's probably what fed into that. But there's more than meets the eye there, right? So we talked about how, again, to our ancestors, this would be a moment rich in meaning, this Northern Lights experience happening so far south. But this also impacts our consciousness and impacts collective consciousness in some very interesting ways. I would even say you could look back at certain historical events that happen on the collective scale, and those are to some degree correlated with certain solar events and certain galactic events going on. And that's not just coincidental. Again, this is how information and consciousness waves are communicated to some degree through photons and things like that. So it all plays a role. And again, like you said earlier, like when we reduce things to surfaces through physicalism, right? If I can't measure it in a lab, it's not real. We basically explain away at all these deeper levels. But I think what we're going to be forced to reckon with is that this is part of what's going on in reality. And again, it's going to get only more and more intense, where we're going to feel this rising tide of energy. It'll be really, really essential that people learn how to deal with it. So as I have said in the classes and whatnot, we experience it more like the 4th of July and less like a war zone, because it could feel like either, depending on how you're learning to work with that kind of energy.
Well, before we leave that topic and kind of get into our other bullet points here, I wanted to ask you a question, because this has been on my mind lately and it comes up often as well. So I shared with you a post from Brett Weinstein. So this is Eric Weinstein's brother, and he had written an article a few years ago specifically about a solar storm that was going to overwhelm the grid and basically signal the demise of human civilization within a couple of hundred years, because we just couldn't bounce back from the devastation that would have caused. And interestingly enough, about that post, he had dated that event to the exact same weekend that this solar storm had occurred. So, when you see something like that, I think it's easy for us to kind of go, oh, that's just a coincidence, and how interesting is that, or whatever. But I think about it from the standpoint of, are we tapping into something that is energetically true? And this kind of comes back to things we've talked about in the past about whether it be like apocalyptic literature, or art. This is something that has resurfaced throughout human history, this sense of really impactful events that are occurring and when they happen to be occurring. We know certainly you're familiar with prophecies and things of that nature. There's a show that my wife and I have been watching called Fallout. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of that show. But, it's another sort of post-apocalyptic story about the end of the world. And, we can say that we're just fascinated in these, post-apocalyptic narratives. But I kind of wonder, and I'm going to get your take on, is there an energetic connection that we have to maybe a deeper reality there? Maybe not only a physical one, but also kind of an energetic or spiritual one, if I dare say.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's true. And when you look back at Hollywood and the kind of movies they've made over the last few decades, you can see how people might argue that they are just feeding propaganda. And sometimes we see evidence of, for instance, the intelligence community giving tips to Hollywood so that they will produce shows that kind of paint them in a certain light. But I think in addition to that, what Hollywood does and what any artist does and what any human being does is pick up on these below the surface kind of currents that are also arising. So when we see a lot of these shows coming up about the end of the world and how do we group together and transition to the other side of that, I think people are picking up on something, both artistically and in terms of their anxiety and these kinds of things. Again, because we have so many ways we can stay preoccupied in the modern world, many people deal with it by just not dealing with it, by just staying busy with other things. Again, that will eventually not be possible. But absolutely, when we talked before about, for instance, events like 9/11, just prior to that, you could see evidence empirically suggesting that humankind was picking up on the fact that something major was coming, and it manifested in terms of collective anxiety levels that were higher than usual. So we saw this both in terms of social media sentiment that was examined afterwards, just across the board, just people were a little bit more anxious and on edge than usual just prior to 9/11. Same thing when we see evidence of how mass consciousness seems to make random number generators go non-random. This also happened just prior to 9/11. So I think we are definitely approaching some major event. And of course, we know by now from this show and POC that NHI have communicated to us, as well as NCHI, non-conventional human intelligence, sort of neo-humans from the future, some that look like gray aliens, some that look more like us, saying that there is something coming and that's part of the reason why they're here. And when something big is coming, like a large stone that drops in a pond, it sends these concentric circles through what we experience as linear time. And we begin to pick up on it subliminally, and it manifests as things like anxiety in the world, or the kind of shows we make, the kind of books we write, the kind of things we're interested in that on some deep level we know is coming. So yes, I think it's absolutely all connected.
Well, I appreciate you speaking to that. Well, and speaking of things that are coming and connected, and certainly the changes that we're seeing happen in the wider conversation, we recently heard that Carl Nell is going to be replacing David Grush at the SALT conference as one of the keynote speakers. I know a lot of folks are disappointed that Dave they had a scheduling conflict. They couldn't quite make that work. And so he fell off the speaker list. But I think it's equally very exciting that Carl Nell has stepped in to be a part of that conversation. He's certainly a vocal advocate for what he likes to call controlled disclosure. And I have a feeling we're going to hear even more about that topic when he addresses the audience at SALT. And I'm not as familiar with kind of the mission of that organization, so maybe you can speak a little bit to what SALT is about, and also what you are looking forward to and hearing from Carl Nell.
Absolutely. And just to say at the beginning here, as we talked about this rising tide of forces co-arising in the world right now, we're also seeing a ramp up in the disclosure narrative in terms of things that happened just this week. So you and I talked last time when we signed off from recording Liminal Phrames that probably something will arise before we record next time. And then sure enough, just in the last few days, there's been this eruption of new things happening. And we're seeing signs that it definitely is moving into the mainstream. Maybe not at the pace that people would like. The New York Times is not making this headline news yet, but something like what Carl Nell is doing points to the fact this is going into the mainstream. So just so everyone knows, Carl Nell is going to be speaking at the SALT New York City conference, and he's presenting a talk called The Real Black Swan Event, the Controlled Disclosure of UAP and Non-Human Intelligence. I mean, that pretty much says it, right? He's got the terms UAP and non-human intelligence in the title, as well as Black Swan Event. Not just that, but the real Black Swan Event. where he seems to be talking about, hinting at the fact that we are approaching this moment of ultimate import and the fact that we want it to be controlled disclosure. So these are really important hints that are right there in the title. Now, in terms of who he's delivering this message to, is it UFO Twitter? Is it a Twitter space? No, it's actually SALT, which is a community of the world's foremost investors, creators, and thinkers. SALT was founded in 2009 by Skybridge Capital, a leading fund of funds, but now operates as a standalone entity, unquote. So that's their about us, basically. So very interesting when you think about Carl Nell. This person has this deep understanding, who's worked on the inside for a long time, who seems to be one of the clear-thinking individuals who really understands the importance to actually do this in a controlled way, because he's very aware of what the opposite would look like in terms of catastrophic disclosure. And he's not just saying that, but he's actually living that mission now, enacting that mission by going into these different circles that are influential in different ways in our world and talking about this, not just in terms of what we have to prepare ourselves for in terms of shock and maybe even ontological shock, but also how we could bring online things like innovation, where we could actually make use of some of these things. In light of what we just talked about at the opening there in terms of climate change and these things that are rising in the world, we might need some of that innovative technology solutions to address some of these concerns. And again, I would argue that's partly what some of the more benevolent NHI have been involved with to help us prepare for. So again, somehow this all looks connected to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's certainly an important signal to be paying attention to when the topic gets into an audience that is comprised of hedge funds and private equity and sovereign wealth funds. I mean, that tells you that it's being taken very, very seriously. I don't think it's mere idle curiosity. Certainly that's a part of it, but kudos to SALT in leading the way and being willing to have this conversation and talk about these events. If you're familiar with the investment world, it's difficult to time the market and sort of beat the market just right. And so you certainly want to know and think about these kinds of events, these black swan events that happen that cause markets to act in ways that we just really couldn't predict. So I think it's a great title for a talk that he's giving, and I'm eager to hear more about what comes out of that conversation and what connections will come out of that conversation. It's just furthering the network of individuals who are connected and interested in this and putting their money, but also their political capital to work behind the topic is a very important effort, and I applaud them for continuing to bring speakers like Carl Nell, and last year I think it was Gary Nolan to that conference. So it's great work on their part. All right, so the next topic I want to touch on is I thought we'd be done with this individual. I thought we would have talked about him and that that chapter would finally be closed. And I've certainly been very charitable to this individual. So if you've been listening to this show, you know that I've tried to extend an olive branch and to suspend my judgment of this person, but I think we've reached a point where I can no longer do so in good faith. And yes, I'm talking about Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick. So recently he was interviewed by Stephen Greenstreet in a brief conversation, some interesting questions asked by Stephen, some that weren't asked that I wish he would have asked as sort of follow-ons. But part of that conversation centered on the presentation that Brandon Fugel gave on the Hill back in 2018. And Stephen knew about this because Brandon had shared that conversation with him when Stephen had gone to visit Brandon and the ranch. Essentially the story is that Brandon brought his group of folks from Skinwalker Ranch to the Hill to meet with not lawmakers, but staffers and other interested parties. He was invited to come on behalf of a Senate staffer to come and give this presentation. This was before the show, The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch, even existed, before Brandon was even publicly known as the owner of the property. So they were invited to come and give a presentation on their research efforts. And the story goes that when they got into this room, Brandon shared with Stephen that a man at the head of the table said, before you even get started in getting into this talk, I just want you to know that everybody at this table, all the gentlemen in this room already believe in the reality of the UFO phenomenon. So you don't have to spend any time convincing us that it's real, okay? And it got out in the rumor mill that that individual who made that quote was Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, at least alleged. And then so Stephen asked him about this. I mean, kudos again to Stephen for asking this question, whether you like, what he does generally or not. He asked Dr. Kirkpatrick, do you recall this meeting from 2018? Do you recall meeting Brandon Fugel? Do you recall saying that that the reality of the UFO, you agreed with the reality of the UFO phenomena? And essentially the answers to those questions were, I don't recall that particular meeting. I think it was in 2017, not 2018. He thinks he was in Colorado in 2018, which he wasn't based on his resume. That he can't recall meeting Brandon Fugel at all. And he just can't remember a briefing on Skinwalker Ranch or UAP phenomena whatsoever. And so that was laid the groundwork for what followed, which was Brandon Fugel bringing the receipts, right? So he released a photo that his paralegal had taken during that meeting, and lo and behold, there's one individual staring at that camera when that photo was taken, and it is Sean Kirkpatrick. So Darren, thoughts on that? It certainly raises a lot of questions and eyebrows, given what we've heard from Kirkpatrick in his public statements.
Indeed. And first of all, I'll say I applaud your desire to give people the benefit of the doubt and to withhold judgment until you think there's clear evidence one way or the other. But it's good to also see that you are seeing something that for you achieves that threshold, because I've kind of had this perspective on Kirkpatrick for a while now, partly even just because of what I pick up from him energetically when I see him speak about these things. But absolutely, it was the smoking gun in some ways, because out of all the people in that room, in this really kind of posh chamber, conference room, the one person, like you say, looking at the camera is none other than Sean Kirkpatrick. And apparently, I think Brandon said that the agreement was that there would be no cameras, but he was already suspicious about how this would be reflected in the future. And so he had his attorney or someone have some sort of his phone on or something, some sort of camera going on, incognito kind of thing. And Brandon has been pretty bold in coming out and saying, I'm tired of the lies. I'm tired of the misrepresentations. This is what actually happened. Like you say, I have the receipts. Here's the photo. Case closed. And absolutely, this looks like egg on the face of Sean Kirkpatrick, because it just stretches credulity to the breaking point to say that he just happened to not remember that kind of event. Like you say, numerous things are interesting there. There were a group of people there. Do you know if it was ever confirmed whether or not the one person was Lakatsky? Because it kind of looked like it from the photo.
Yeah, that I think still remains to be seen. That's been the speculation. It wouldn't surprise me if he was present. I certainly would like Brandon to provide more detail, but I also could see that he may be protecting identities to the best that he can. And since he feels like he got called out by Kirkpatrick, he felt comfortable releasing that. But yeah, there's more detail about that meeting that we just don't know.
Yeah, indeed. So it was an interesting group of people. And clearly what is going on here, like you pointed to, is that it opened up with this statement apparently from Kirkpatrick saying, you don't have to just try to make the case for UAP. We in this room are already very familiar with this, which again doesn't square with what Kirkpatrick has said about how he got the job with Arrow to begin with and what his background and interest in this topic is. Certainly doesn't seem to match up the history again. So what it seems like is the case here is that we are seeing that this disinformation campaign is being undone because we're seeing evidence being presented. And again, this is so interesting. We'll get into this later on in terms of what's happening in light of the apparent threats that were made towards Lou Elizondo recently. But when we live in a social media kind of world where things can be responded to very, very quickly, we have very, very diligent researchers who keep receipts, as well as billionaire real estate owners who happen to own Skinwalker Ranch to also keep receipts. And because of that, these spin doctors have a much harder time spin doctoring than they used to, kind of thing. I've spoken before about in previous decades when you had a few major newspapers in the world that you could pay a few journalists to skew things a little bit in terms of how they reported on things. And there was no social media. There was no way that people could come together and try to investigate something like the phenomenon from a private point of view, actually begin to do research on their own. Up until then, we were completely dependent on the government telling us what this was. And we know how that went historically. And even the invention of AI, for instance, has become really useful in terms of unearthing some of those disinformation campaigns from the past, which you can find. You have the receipts actually sitting in the historical record now, things that never could have been predicted back then. But absolutely, for me, it was one of these moments like you take a moment to stop and go, we will remember this moment. This was a key turning point where the narratives that seemed to be co-arising and not fitting together well, suddenly it felt like evidence came forward that backed up one particular narrative much more than the other. That's how I look at it. I'm curious, again, for your emotional reaction when you saw it happen in light of this competing narrative that we've seen going on for so long.
Yeah, well, I found it a little bit ironic that this strong moment occurred resulting from a conversation with Stephen Greenstreet, who's been a vocal opponent to the narrative of the UAP reality. So I kind of almost wonder what he's dealing with and how he's juggling this information. And I've heard different sort of excuses from folks on the debunker side or the skeptical side about what may have occurred here, and trying to kind of make excuses for Kirkpatrick's responses. And I think those are interesting. So one is that, he's got thousands of meetings he's been in, in the last several years. How could he possibly remember one of these meetings, any of them, quite frankly? I mean, I get it. Look, I'm in meetings every day, all day as well. I understand sometimes it's hard to remember what meeting I was in a year ago or what have you. But I can tell you that if I was in a meeting that was about something that I normally don't talk about, and particularly if it was about, paranormal phenomena and some spooky secret ranch out in Utah, I think I would remember that. It would stand out to me, particularly if that's not in something in my day-to-day, their day-to-day routine. Now, if he doesn't remember it, then I almost think, well, maybe he's in more of these briefings than he's not, which is also interesting, right? So if it's not memorable because it's just like part of the same content that you're always hearing, that raises even more questions, right? So maybe he's more involved in this subject than we tend to think he might be. I'm also curious to see what public statements we'll hear from him, if any, trying to explain away this particular incident. And after it occurred, I went and looked at his LinkedIn professional profile, looked at his employment history and the timeline there, because I wanted to see when did this sort of line up. It took place in April of 2018, and when did this line up with where he was at his career, in part because he said he was in Colorado at the time, which he wasn't, according to this resume timeline, but also because he was listed as being part of the National Security Council, which is no small council, everybody. That's one of the most critical councils in our entire U.S. governmental apparatus, charged with securing the nation. It's run by the president. The president is literally the head of that council. Doesn't necessarily always attend those meetings because they have a lot on their plate usually. But it's made up a lot of very senior, very important people from all the different agencies. And why was Sean Kirkpatrick tapped to come to this conversation on UAP? So it raises a ton of questions there.
Indeed. And that's a great point, because a couple of things I want to raise here. Number one, if it's true, to your point, that he's actually perhaps been involved in lots of those kinds of conversations around UFOs and even the paranormal and the connection, the co-arising aspect of that. And he's also been involved with something as senior as the National Security Council. That begins to beg questions around, could those matters be related? And might that be the manner in which he's appearing in that kind of council to actually give information about those kinds of things to the president and other people who are making national security decisions at the highest level, perhaps. What I also find a really fun accident of history, of course, though I don't think it's actually accidental. These things are all synchronistically arising somehow. But Stephen Greenstreet, who famously is so skeptical about Skinwalker Ranch and those kind of matters, I pointed out many times that he employs neurolinguistic programming to try to dismiss these things just with certain words, right? So he'll say spooky, wacky, crazy, right? He'll use these adjectives over and over again in his X posts / Twitter posts in social media. And for a lot of people, that actually will make them dismiss the topic because of just these smears that he's basically including. But isn't it ironic that his questioning of Sean Kirkpatrick would open up not just the fact that Sean Kirkpatrick was present at a UFO briefing, but a briefing about Skinwalker Ranch, one of the most paranormal places in the world, where we see, again, thinking back to Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, these notions that somehow these things are all related, that beings crawling out of portals that appear in mid-sky UFOs, strange magnetic anomalies, all these things are somehow connected. And as Colm Kelleher and other people who have PhDs have made this claim, you research this because this is what the data suggests you should do. They just followed the data. And they made the argument back in OSAP days that to exclude one because it's not politically correct or not convenient or not conventional is to ignore where the data is telling you to look. So very, very interesting. And what we see in the fact that these key players within government, these insiders, including perhaps Sean Kirkpatrick, were present, were willing to attend such a meeting, suggests that they themselves also know that somehow UFOs and these paranormal kind of events are all wrapped up together somehow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can't take Skinwalker Ranch out of the equation. It's a part of this story, and it continues to resurface in pretty important, critical ways. So really fascinating revelation there. Very curious to see where that continues to go. It also dovetails with some other recent sound bites that we've heard that speak to the fact that we've had different narratives coming out of the government, with Arrow saying one thing, and then we're hearing other sound bites from individuals connected to some of these events that seem to contradict the official, quote unquote, official story of what has taken place. Here I'm talking specifically about the Langley Air Force Base drone footage that I think was highlighted on the Good Trouble show. I think I have that correct. I know the footage was very dark, but there were witnesses who claimed to have sighted some of those drones, and they were behaving in very strange ways, including one individual that claims to have seen a saucer-shaped kind of craft that was seen. So that's certainly very interesting and absolutely different than what we've been hearing about that Langley incident. And then also we recently heard that the Eglin Air Force Base incident that was supposedly a lighting balloon or whatever that just got untethered and drifted off into the atmosphere and caught the eye of some pilots and caused them to think that they were anomalous craft. That there was apparently no video footage of that whatsoever, that it must have been a balloon because it's just the most prosaic explanation. Turns out it sounds like we have two F-22 Raptors who actually did capture footage of that and claimed to have said that the craft was indeed anomalous in its behavior and form. So, Darren, what do you make of this? And this seems like a recurring trend, right? We have kind of an official statement, and then we have whistleblowers, quote unquote, soft whistleblowers in some instances contradicting the official narrative.
Indeed, there's a few different ways we can tackle this, and I think we should tackle this at different levels. First of all, these drone swarms, which basically translates as these anomalous objects are appearing en masse in sensitive areas around sensitive weapons facilities and things like that. And again, only within about 200 miles of Washington, D.C. So again, it's one thing if these were happening out of the ocean, either the Pacific or the Atlantic or off the coast of San Diego or whatever. But when this is happening over the continental U.S., so close to our nation's capital, it raises questions. We, of course, often hear this funny question. It's kind of a cliche at this point. Why don't they land on the White House lawn? Well, they're getting pretty close because apparently if these are anomalous objects, they're only a couple hundred miles away. Now, some interesting details have come out since then. We'll get to the other one in a second in terms of what the Raptors saw. But with these ones, like you said, there's been a witness who claimed to have seen much of this happening. And as you pointed to, while the video, it's difficult to make out shapes, you can really only see the lights against the night sky. What he claimed he saw was actually anomalous objects acting anomalously in terms of their method of moving about the sky, perhaps suggesting that things like anti-grav kind of technology and that kind of thing. But to your point, also apparently saw something like a flying saucer-like object as well that came down low and then was only a couple hundred feet off the ground, kind of at tree level, I think, treetop level at one point he said. And while in the video you can't really make that out because, again, you can only really see the lights, the fact that someone's saying, in addition to these quote-unquote drones, we also have a classic flying saucer shape, which is much more comfortably within the UFO phenomenon in terms of shapes we talk about, helps move this beyond just the notion this could be, as you made the point last time, the Hobby Club of Virginia, or even some foreign adversary being pretty bold and brazen in terms of buzzing our secure weapons facilities. The fact that we saw a flying saucer, according to this testimony anyway, suggests again even more so that this is really, truly anomalous. I also want to address the lights, because some people have said, well, but apparently these were, lit up. Why would flying saucers or UFOs have lights? To be clear here, as I made the point in the last episode, I think, number one, UFOs frequently have lights. This is one of the strange things, because people, again, that are skeptics come in and say, listen, these guys don't have to adhere to FAA regulations. Why would they have lights at all? And I've heard even people like George Knapp make the point, as have I, that perhaps if they want to be seen. When they don't want to be seen, you don't see them. And that speaks to the fact that we have so little really high-quality footage, at least publicly, even in today's age where we have high-quality camera phones everywhere, right? But when they do want to be seen, they are not shy about using lights, bright lights, colored lights, blinking lights. And what this testimony was suggesting is that the nature of the way these lights were blinking was not like what you would see with an aircraft that was following FAA guidelines. That it seemed kind of random. Sometimes it would blip, 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 blip really fast in pattern and then be slower. And there didn't seem to be an ongoing repeating pattern to it. So there was even something anomalous about the ways the lights were blinking themselves. So when you begin to put all this together, the fact that, as we touched on last time, entire jet squadrons had to be redirected because this was so interfering with normal procedure. And on top of that, we're never able to capture them. We're never able to shoot them down. We're never able to determine where they're coming from. And now we hear about notions that they have very anomalous lighting patterns and that they are accompanied by something like a flying saucer, which reminds us of other testimony about other events in the past where, in addition to objects, some sort of mothership is spotted that perhaps these things are docking with. So again, it starts to sound a lot more sci-fi once we add these additional details that have come out recently.
Yeah, I'm definitely curious to see where that trend goes, and we continue to see a ramping up there in sightings and reportings. I think I, like many people, am very frustrated by the different narratives that we're hearing, and it ends up being almost like a he said, she said situation. And I worry that we're never really going to escape that cycle of information, that we have government statements that seemingly contradict what we're hearing on the ground. That just seems to continue. We have whistleblowers coming out and saying, well, another thing. And so we're in need of some real legislative effort here with teeth, I think, to get to the bottom of what's actually going on, to some legitimate transparency. And on that front, you mentioned to me that Nick Gold had provided an update on sort of the lobbying and the legislative efforts. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. And then we just recently heard, as in a couple of hours ago, about a new bill that might be introduced by Tim Burchett. So what is Nick Gold saying in terms of the progress of the legislative effort in this particular year?
Yeah, so I'll get to that. We should also get back to the Raptors and what that whole thing involved too, because there's some interesting additional details there. But I just want to point out the things that Nathan and I are using as our bullet points here. This has all happened since we last recorded an episode, which was only 2 weeks ago. So for those who are feeling like this is moving at a snail's pace, actually we're seeing a lot happen, remarkably so. In fact, we had to sort of think, are we going to get to all these in one episode? But yeah, this is what Nick Gold said in terms of what's coming next in terms of the proposed legislation. We know that the Schumer Amendment got gutted significantly before anything was passed into law. Where is the process going to take us this year in 2024? Because we know that this whole NDAA goes through this process every year. So Nick Gold said, quote, "My understanding is that HASC, that's the House Armed Service Committee, I'm assuming, is marking up their version of the FY25 fiscal year 25, that would be NDAA, next week, May 22nd. This is when the House's version of the bill will be solidified. Remember, this is a parallel process to the Senate putting together their own version of the FY25 NDAA. Each chamber will pass their own version of the bill, and the two will then need to be brought together into a single final bill via the murky, quote-unquote, reconciliation process. This is where the UAPDA got chopped last year. We can expect this to likely take place in November, December of this year, 24. We want each chamber to have the best possible UAP language in their own versions of the NDAA ahead of the reconciliation process. U.S. voters, if your House rep is on the House Armed Service Committee, now is the time to let them know you expect them to support meaningful government UAP declassification, including passage of the UAPDA. This lets you do in less than 30 seconds what you need to do. Follow up with a 2-minute call to your rep's DC office using our call tool, which includes guidance on key talking points, unquote. So there he's giving us an update, and he's also recommending that we be proactive in trying to lobby our Congress people to do something about this, take it seriously, so that hopefully this time around there's less of a gutting of the key elements of the final bill.
Yeah, so fingers crossed that we will see some good progress there. And I think he's right that if we can get quality into the language from both chambers now, then once it gets to reconciliation, they're going to be more alike than not. And that means we'll have less likelihood of something significant being chopped off. So fingers crossed that that can actually be accomplished. And I didn't mean to sort of change the topic so abruptly because I am still very curious about this Eglin Air Force Base F-22 Raptor footage. So what more do you know about that?
Well, what's interesting about it that, again, adds a lot of credibility is the corroboration we now have, because initially there was a report of one fighter jet and one pilot that observed this, and him apparently saying this looked anomalous to him. And again, I want to remind people, these are people we spend millions of dollars training so they become expert witnesses. They know what they're looking for. This is not your average Joe. These are people that are trained to be able to recognize things and what they are. And that first pilot reported apparently that it was anomalous, that it was something that was not only looking anomalous, something like a space capsule kind of thing, but also that it was behaving anomalously as well and seemed to have even anomalous kind of propulsion. But to that point, he did notice what looked like a blurring underneath, which to him looked like a heat signature, suggesting, again, most balloons I'm aware of do not have heat signatures attached to them. But most importantly, we now know there was a second pilot and a second F-22 Raptor that also beheld this same kind of object. And this is interesting, was actually from a different squadron or something. So we returned to a different base, and independently of the other pilot, reported that he also beheld this, and he also found it anomalous. That's why he reported on it, actually. So it's not like these guys even had a chance to compare stories. They're landing at different places and independently giving this testimony about what they saw. So this adds a lot of credibility, I think, that the official arrow argument that this is just balloons seems to fall apart more and more the more that you look at what was going on here. I just want to point out, too, that when we think about what's happening with the quote-unquote drone swarms that now apparently include things like flying saucers and anomalous kind of propulsion and anomalous behavior, but we're also having this thing happen with these F-22 Raptors, two different ones independently observing an object that seems to be a genuine UAP. There seems to be a ramping up. Again, I want to put this out. There's a couple interesting notes here. Number one, as I said last time, right when we see the DoD and the Pentagon trying to wrap this up and close it down, we're seeing events that seem to be pushing against that. So again, it makes you ask yourself questions. Who would be doing that? Is it NHI who are deliberately trying to say, not so fast, DoD, we're going to do this more and more. We're going to be brazen about it. We're going to do it all over U.S. airspace, even over sensitive U.S. airspace. So you have no chance to try to bury this because eventually this becomes so brazen that you have to start talking about it. So either it's NHI doing that, or as I've suggested, I've heard part of what we sometimes see happening is that elements of the original gatekeepers, whether it's even people who are the descendants of those people who've inherited those positions, some of that group has split off from the original gatekeepers and are actually trying to push for disclosure, sometimes even involving operating ARVs, alien reproduced vehicles that have been reverse engineered based on the tech that was recovered. And the point being that even if it is actually our tech, but it's been reverse engineered, then that still will push for disclosure because the questions will inevitably turn to how do we have this tech? Where did it come from? So this is what's in play here. Lastly, point I want to make about that is that, again, people like George Knapp and Jeremy Corbell reported on the fact that there seems to be increased reporting coming from commercial pilots as well, not just military pilots. Now, you and I touched on last time, that's probably partly because some of the stigma is hopefully reducing and people feel more comfortable coming forward. But the sense I'm getting is that it's more than that. There literally might be more activity in our skies, which again, when you add this all up together, in light of all the things that are coming together in the world, the geopolitical conflict we're seeing happen, the climate change issue, all these things co-arising while we're also seeing this uptick inactivity from NHI or even potentially from neo-human future humans who are here in light of some event that's coming. I can't help but say this somehow seems all connected to me.
Yeah, the issue doesn't seem to be going away. There's not been, in my opinion, any specific effort that has really turned down the interest, the volume in this topic. And I think I speak for many people by saying it's time for some answers, dadgummit. And on that regard, we did hear just recently that Tim Burchett introduced a 2-page bill, or he plans to introduce this bill in the House. I don't think it's been formally introduced, but it's fairly simple. And essentially it's giving a time mandate to the heads of the federal agencies who happen to be in possession of UAP documentation, information, to release that documentation on a public website and do so in an expeditious manner. And then giving the president, of course, the authority to make sure that that's happening, checking in quarterly to make sure that those releases are occurring and that information is getting out. So it's not a very complicated piece of legislation. There's not a lot of detail there. I just get the sense from him that he really wants this information to come out. And even if it's imperfect, he just wants to get something on the books to try to force this issue out and get some agencies to play ball. And that point, I think, is a point that is well worth discussing. And that is, the government is not a monolithic organization. We like to think of it as that there's some sort of singular puppet master there calling the shots at the government, but it's not the case. They're all different kinds of agencies with their own different kinds of agendas. They also interpret legislation differently if that legislation is aimed at them. So they can sort of look at the language of legislation and make a decision on how they are going to comply with that or not comply with that. And so what I see there, even though I could say, oh, this may not have a lot of teeth to it, or maybe won't result in a lot of real meaningful information, all it takes is one agency who's willing to play ball with the spirit of this legislation. And then you've got a situation that you can no longer control. You've got one agency stepping forward, providing real, tangible documentation, and the other agencies that aren't. And so that only just leads to more questions. Well, hey, CIA, don't you happen to have something on this? It seems like you should. So where is that? We're hearing from, the NSA or whatever, that they have documentation. So it would take a lot of coordination amongst these agencies who, again, have different agendas. As you pointed out before, some of the individuals who've been part of the gatekeeping process are certainly connected to some of these agencies. Some of those individuals want the information to come out. Some of them do not. And I just think what we're seeing is maybe not controlled disclosure per se, but the horses are leaving the barn and it's hard to get them back in. So even though I might like to see more detailed language in the legislative effort from Burt Burchett and others, I still think it could move the ball forward if it ends up getting passed.
I would also point out that because historically this topic has been scoffed at and ridiculed for so long, we've had so many X-Files moments, that whenever legislation is proposed, even if it is not ultimately adopted, it still helps move to normalize this topic, become something that is not scoffed at, that people can actually have conversations around. Again, we think about Carl Nell giving a talk at this investment group, this key investment group. This is signs of progress. This is signs that is beginning to be metabolized in the mainstream, which is exactly what you would want to see happen as part of some controlled disclosure campaign. You have to seed it into the collective consciousness so that when you finally provide the evidence that confirms it, it's already been to a large degree grounded into people's expectation. So that's really, really key. I also think it's interesting because with Tim Burchett, we see somebody who, we know likely he's going to perhaps not get this passed, because we've seen times before where he will acknowledge when it comes to these hearings and whatnot that unless people higher up than him actually agree to these things, then it might not happen. But yes, to your point, the fact that he's even proposing it is helpful. He clearly is someone who is on the side of believing there is a there. We have situations where some other people were not so clear about that. So Eric Burleson, for instance, came out of that last gift briefing with Arrow and seemed to drink the Kool-Aid, so to speak, when they said, actually, this is all top secret U.S. tech, and we have to be really careful because, it might put us at a disadvantage if this came out accidentally because people were asking the wrong questions. He seemed like he was inclined to believe that, actually, which again speaks to pre-existing worldviews, right? So his worldview was such that he thinks these things are unlikely to be true, that non-human intelligence operating these craft would be in our midst. And so when he's given some sort of plausible testimony, even from the gatekeepers, from the secret keepers, from the DoD and the Pentagon, he's likely to believe that because it creates the least amount of cognitive dissonance for his pre-existing worldview. Whereas you have someone like Tim Burchett, who clearly believes that there's something's going on here. Now, he has his own worldview issues where he thinks that CU5 might be summoning demons, right? So his evangelical Christianity comes in. But this speaks to the complexity of the matter, because we have not only the truth underneath all of this, but we also have all these layers of worldviews overlapping as we try to metabolize this as a civilization.
Yes, and I want to come back to that notion of the truth and what that might actually be, because it is quite complicated. Well, along the lines of what we're talking about here in terms of information coming out from different places and different sources, we're finally starting to hear some more tangible rumors of the book from Lou Elizondo having a release date, potentially sometime this year. In fact, I think he was spotted near the publisher recently. That seemed to be a very good sign that this was in motion and happening soon. So we're hearing more from Mr. Elizondo. He's certainly being a lot more vocal in social media than he has been in some time. And in addition to the book, which is, of course, highly anticipated, we're hearing, and we just heard, I think it was yesterday, that there were some real credible threats that have been levied at Lou and Dave and others in terms of them coming forward as with information that they happen to have, threats against themselves, threats against their family members. It's very concerning stuff. The statements that Lou made on the Good Trouble show were sobering, just in terms of, that he's not suicidal, that he's not prone to having accidents, that kind of thing. And that's the kind of language that you when you see that happen in the press and the public, you start really wondering how much in danger is this individual. So it's very interesting. I certainly asked myself, like, why now? Why Lou Elizondo in particular? Obviously, he seems to have a lot of information, but he's also the most vocal proponent who's been doing the media tours and has been championing this subject for so long. It would seem very strange to me to basically kind of make a martyr out of this individual and then cause an uptick in interest that there might be something to this. So I don't know. Is this an act of desperation? What do you make of these kinds of claims? And they're certainly not new. I mean, I saw even today that Randall Nickerson posted that, that he had been the recipient of similar threats in the past and had tried to do something about them, but nothing really came of it. So this isn't necessarily new, but it does seem to be increasing and concerning.
Yes, there's a few nuances to get here, but just for those who perhaps didn't see the statement that Elizondo provided, it was basically a prepared statement that was read on the Good Trouble show, and then Matt and Ross basically both debriefed on that. But this is the statement that Elizondo made. He said, quote, "To add insult to injury, I was notified yesterday that there may be a personal threat against myself and several other whistleblowers formerly associated with the UAP effort for the U.S. government. As such, I would like to make this perfectly clear to the American people. I am not prone to accidents. I am not suicidal. I am not abusing drugs. I am not engaged in any illicit activities. If something happens to me or my family members in the future, you will know what happened, ! Unquote. So I think we brought this up in one of our last couple episodes, this notion that sometimes what you see happening as part of the historical enterprise to cover this up is a surprising number of suicides, quote unquote, things that are made to look like suicides. So it's interesting that Lou here is coming out ahead of time to say, just so everyone is perfectly clear on this matter, I'm not suicidal in the least. So that makes it less likely to be a credible explanation if something does happen to him in a nefarious manner. Make it very clear publicly that he is not at all suicidal, so that ends up being something that they cannot use as a tactic. Because again, in this day and age, again, think about the octopus murders that we talked about in the last episode. This is often used, and it's difficult to trace back for sure whether or not it actually is suicide. So by saying these statements ahead of time, it makes it much more difficult for them to use that tactic. Now, that said, to your point, yes, the timing is strange because it seems highly unlikely that even a threat of this magnitude would make Lou think twice about publishing this book. That is already well underway, right? It's been sent to the publisher. It's now probably being put through final edits. It's already been through the DOPSR process, which was pretty long. Apparently that's what took the longest amount of time, was getting that approved. So already the gatekeepers have approved whatever is going to be published, right? So we know that. So it's unlikely to be the official gatekeepers, I think, that are making these kinds of threats. I think it's much more likely that somebody is a bit unhinged within the program in these circles where there's this culture of secrecy. You do not talk, stay in your lane. That's kind of the culture, the calcified culture. So probably my guess is someone from one of those kind of circles spoke out because they're just so frustrated in the moment, kind of like overheated, and made some sort of threat, something like that. I don't think it's part of an organized campaign. I think that has been absolutely part of the process in the past. But at this point, the ship has already sailed. This book is going to be published. And as you and I have discussed privately, if anything were to happen to Elizondo of all people, that would absolutely make him a martyr. And it would just light a fire under all the lawmakers that something must be going on here. That would probably bring more heads to attention than any other matter possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we certainly are concerned for his safety and the safety of all the whistleblowers that are making efforts to come forward. Hopefully nothing happens to them. Hopefully they're kept safe. We heard a strong statement from Ross Coulthart in the same show yesterday, that him coming out and saying that he knows the names of these gatekeepers, that he has them, that he would be happy to release them if he had to. So don't sort of press this further, kind of calling their bluff to a certain extent. So that, things are escalating, or at least there's a sense of escalation here. I certainly have questions about that, the timing, etc. What is this meant to do? It's certainly increasing the attention on the subject, which is important. So we'll see what's going to happen there. But I certainly back the efforts of Ross and Lou and others in trying to continue to move the ball forward in this area. And, we're seeing this even more broadly, right? The drumbeat of whistleblowers is really increasing just generally. We saw news this week. There was an anonymous Reddit post that got shared pretty widely from someone that claimed to be a part of one of these programs, and sort of detailing various aspects of the program, that we have, bodies, that we have craft, that we're still studying the craft. We're trying to make, sort of technological leaps from the study of the craft, but there's a lot that we still don't know. Highlighting how some of the crash retrieval process might actually work, and the organizations involved with locating those crashes, etc. So really interesting. I know there's been a lot of speculation, and there always is, for these sort of anonymous Reddit posts, which I believe this one has even been taken down recently or deleted. There's always speculation about these things, particularly now in the time of AI. You always had that claim levied that this just seems like the fever dream of an LLM coming up with a story here, and it just sounds very believable. But you pointed out to me before the show that there were elements of this story, of this account, that really rang true for you. So what was your impression of this post, and what were the things that really got you paying close attention to it?
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the things I was talking to you about was how, again, speaking of worldviews, we have different thresholds for when we think something is credible or not. And those thresholds are largely more impacted than anything else by our worldviews, by our pre-existing narratives by which we use to steer our ways through the world. So if you are already pretty convinced that the nature of reality is considerably different than we've been taught, then you're much more likely to be further along in terms of believing something that is absolutely believable. And now it's just down to the nuances of what it is that actually look like. But if you are a conventional physicalist, for instance, then you're going to find all of these just absurd on the face of them. And so you're just going to assume these people can't be credible. But I just want to point out again, it's amazing how much personal experience will change people's perspective. Our friend Mike Masters has spoken about how he, not that many years ago, was a reductionistic materialist. He just assumed that's the way the world worked. And then through his own personal experiences more than anything else, partly because, to his credit, he looks at data and he takes it seriously. He doesn't assume people are, kind of like AI, that they're not hallucinating, that actually they are, to the best of their ability, recounting events that happened to them. And we have so much of that evidence that it seems to be pointing to something. And then he himself began to have some of these experiences, and they were of a nature that really completely revolutionized the way he saw reality itself. So again, I just want to point out that where people begin, where they are on that spectrum, makes a big difference in terms of whether or not they're comfortable calling these people credible or not. But there's a few things I want to point out as well. I saw some people that are kind of more skeptical, or somewhere in the middle maybe, saying they didn't find this person that credible, this most recent whistleblower that came out on Reddit, because so many of the elements they brought up have been mentioned elsewhere by Bob Lazar or different people. But of course, that's kind of a funny argument to make, because if this is the underlying reality, then of course some elements should match up. We would expect that. To expect a testimony that is completely novel would be strange in my mind. If we had 17 testimonies that all were completely different, that would suggest to me that there's some sort of weird psyop going on, not that there's something underlyingly true about this. So we should expect some overlaps. And again, this reminds us of what happened to Dave Grush, where people like Stephen Greenstreet and other people, skeptical, said, it sounds like he's just read too many sci-fi novels. He's gotten back to all these 70s and 80s UFO magazines and read too much and is just regurgitating the lore, or has listened to people who basically had read those magazines and were regurgitating the lore, a friend of a friend kind of thing. But of course, on the flip side, the point is, if these elements that are part of the lore, part of the historical lore, are actually touching on real events, then of course we will find that someone like David Grush will give testimony that matches up with that. And this seems to be the case, that while there has been this careful crafting of also releasing disinformation, a lot of things have been released that are true. And again, we've heard the argument that this is because there has been this effort made to either purposefully get this out, or some of it has accidentally leaked, but you have plausible deniability around it because it comes through funny means or from people that are not necessarily considered frontline, credible, in traditional academic ways. Someone like maybe like a Tom DeLonge, something like that, right? So, and on top of that too, there are elements in someone's testimony that to me lend credibility when their testimony is not perfect, when it's not airtight. If I see a testimony that seems too clean, too polished, I'm actually suspicious that that was a pre-formatted, preconceived kind of testimony, as opposed to someone who's just off the cuff giving their testimony to the best of their recollection. So some of this guy's testimony did look a bit unclean, did look a little bit messy, did look like that sometimes he was waxing philosophic rather than just relying on what he actually had been told or seen. But that's what someone who's acting like a normal human being would act. That's my point. If it's too clean, too perfect, too polished, that sounds like that in itself might be a psychological operation. So this lends credibility to me. Now, I would like to bring up a couple points he made as part of his testimony. And to your point you made earlier, yes, sure enough, he's now deleted this initial post, which a lot of people thought he might. So there's always people who quickly take screenshots because they expect this is going to happen. I don't know how recently this happened. I just happened to look today and told you that, interestingly, it's been taken down. Many people did warn him, even in that Reddit thread. You've probably given too much personal testimony here. They probably will be able to track you down. Could it be something like what happened to Elizondo and the threats there that made him think twice? I would suggest that's the case. I don't think my first assumption is that this is a guy who made up a story and then his conscience got the better of him and he deleted it. I don't think that's what's happening. I think that he, again, like a lot of these whistleblowers experience, this burning sensation of humankind deserves to know this. This is too big a deal to keep secret. And he published it to the best of his ability based on his recollection. And then later, because of concern for his safety, he took it down. But there's a few things he brought up that were very interesting. We know somehow that this is all connected to the dawn of the nuclear era, the atomic era, around the same kind of places too, which is very interesting. But one of the things he said was that nuclear explosions and experiments somehow interfere with their navigation specifically. Now, of course, this speaks to this notion that why would they crash? Why would these craft that are coming either interdimensionally or from across the cosmos crash in the Nevada desert and that kind of thing, New Mexico desert? Well, he's arguing that it's because that's exactly where we were doing our atomic weapons testing, was in the deserts of the Southwest, and that created EMPs electromagnetic pulses or whatever that would actually interfere with the navigation. And I remember making this point in a really early Liminal Phrames episode that sometimes we think it's a stretch to imagine that any of our tech, which is surely low tech compared to theirs, could bring down their craft. But sometimes it's precisely because there's such a gap in technology that they're not accounting for somebody, running some sort of technology from centuries ago. And so they don't test for that kind of thing. So that's quite likely in my mind. And I think this lends some credibility to the reason why we would see these crashes, even these sightings upticking right around the dawn of the atomic era, which is really interesting. Even to the point where he said he was aware that the craft would avoid Diablo Canyon because we did so much nuclear testing there. I'd like to get in a couple other elements, but first I would love to get your take. It's always interesting to sort of do this experiencer, non-experiencer comparison. So for yourself, when you read this kind of testimony, how did it land for you?
Yeah, I resonate with what you said in terms of how it's fashioned. It's not perfect. There were some details in there that on the first read of it, I definitely thought, oh, that's too much information to share if you want to try to remain anonymous. It read very much like a person who's been involved. I found it interesting the comment that he made about there being kind of classes of individuals that get recruited to work in these programs, and that there's a lot of turnover. And then so that you kind of know, like, oh yeah, I was there at the same time as this person, and there are different groups of individuals that sort of get cycled in and out of the org. That was particularly interesting. It does seem as if it's a person just like you and I, that they're working on this, they're applying their knowledge, and they're doing it for a good cause, but perhaps one day their conscience or whatever just gets the better of them, and they decide to come forward and share the information, whether for just to get it off their chest or for attention or whatnot. So it's going to be a mixture of those things, I think. I mean, it's an imperfect process. I did find it interesting, the comment that he made about that they like to recruit individuals from BYU, which honestly rang true for me. I have a very close friend who is in the Air Force, and he did go to BYU, and I could very much see why that kind of person would be involved with this. In fact, this individual, my friend, has been involved with some very, high profile assignments, for similar, reasons. So it's quite interesting there that there might be a connection. That's a detail that I don't know that we've particularly heard before, but certainly makes a lot of sense. And there's a lot of individuals like that within the Air Force, proper. So it also kind of calls back to Jason Sands, right? We talked about that recently, and how Jason, came forward on X Space, and there was a lot of, people saying that, oh, that should never happen. Like, that's an appropriate way to come forward with your story. But I mean, to me, this is what we're going to see. We have an imperfect whistleblower process. We have an organization that doesn't seem to be very trustworthy. We're at a breaking point where more and more folks are just tired of keeping the secret. And we have all of these avenues for getting the information out. It's not like you just can go to the New York Times and say, hey, I've got this fantastic story, publish it. You can self-publish. And so, yes, it might be frustrating to us that it's not coming out in some sort of quote unquote official capacity. But at the same time, this is what I would expect to see. Leaks happening here and there, everywhere. And their takes are very genuine. They're not saying they have all the answers. They're saying, I was a part of this aspect of the program. This is what I observed. This is what I was able to piece together. I'm not entirely sure what the whole picture is. I mean, you hear that pretty often. And that is exactly what I would expect to hear if this is what was going on and people were coming forward sharing their aspect of the story.
Absolutely true. And I would even say that partly what added credibility to me was the fact that he actually said some things that I think are actually incorrect. So it's not just that someone isn't perfect and polished in how they say these things, but sometimes people's biases are such that they say things that are not perfectly correct. And even Jason Sands sometimes said some things that didn't exactly fit with the lore, which says that perhaps he's not a guy who's spending all of his nights perusing UFO Twitter to learn the lore, right? So he's actually more likely, therefore, reflecting on his actual experiences and the actual intelligence that he was provided, even if that sometimes involved not having a full understanding, which would make sense. If you're working in those programs in an official capacity, then you're only going to be told information that's relevant to what you're working on. And absolutely, there's a strict need to know. You're only told whatever is relevant to your specific task and nothing else. And this other whistleblower also made that point. So we should expect some gaps in their knowledge, I think, because they're not the kind of people that are sitting in their mom's basement reading UFO X every night. It's actually people who are professionals that are living these lives and having these careers. Now, a couple other things to point out about him. So one of the quotes that I think still remains, because the comments that he made in answering people's questions are still there. He said, and this speaks to what we talked about earlier about the lack of high quality video. He said, quote, "We have videos of enormous lit up craft at night, radar data of flying at incomprehensible speed, stopping on a dime, and then going 90 degrees in another direction. I'm mad that these aren't in public hands. I saw someone comment about how Snowden didn't see anything about NHI, and it's because these videos exist on one server in one building. There are 2 backups of the server that get worked on every year or so, depending on how much is added to them. All other copies of the videos and images on the server get destroyed. Documents can be shared between facilities for research purposes and are checked out, not unlike version control at a software company or a library book," unquote. So again, that kind of testimony lends credibility to me. We often hear skeptics say there's no way this secret could be kept so well for so long. But again, as Leslie DeCane pointed out, more money goes towards security than goes to the actual investigation of the craft and the reverse engineering process. So it just shows you how seriously they take maintaining security. And he's making the point that, again, if you keep these on one server and you don't duplicate, you don't have it across some sort of network that other people could accidentally stumble across, then you're much more likely to keep it secret. So again, this to me lends credibility to the notion that someone like this really did experience this. I think it's fascinating. And again, this points to the fact that even people like Elizondo and Chris Mellon have talked about there is better video. There's HD video of some of the events, even historically, that we've been told about. And people have been lobbying the DoD to release the video. It's very difficult to argue at this point that it's really a national security concern that's preventing that. One of the things that people make in terms of an argument is, if it's true that we're so concerned about national security, that's why we won't release, for instance, the footage from those F-22 Raptors. Why is it that when something happens in some sort of skirmish with China or North Korea, within hours, we see footage from the craft, right? High quality HD footage. Something's not adding up here. Again, it seems like they don't want to release it, not because there's national security implications, but because it would confirm that these are non-human craft operated in ways that are anomalous.
Yes. Will we ever see it? I hope we will. I'm incredibly curious. I know everyone is. These incidents they're not going away. I don't think we're done hearing from whistleblowers. If anything, we might be surrounded by them before too long, and it might even be difficult to juggle the different testimonies that we're hearing from them. Keep in mind, these programs are highly compartmented. They may have only certain aspects of the program, and they're coming forward with their perspective. So just like we've seen in the history of this topic, because there have been leaks throughout the decades, there are sometimes conflicting narratives about what is the truth behind the entire thing. And that makes it very, very challenging. And one thing he pointed out that I think we certainly touched on before, and that's that the government doesn't have a good answer for a lot of this. That it just doesn't know the whole truth. So that it doesn't want to come forward and say, here's what we've got in a freezer, and we have no idea where they come from. We don't know all their capabilities. We have some of their craft. We're trying to engineer them, but we're not making much progress. Oh, and by the way, they're actually still showing up from time to time in our skies. So sleep tight. It's just not the kind of message that you want to deliver. You want to be able to say with confidence that you know what's going on. So really, really interesting how this is continuing to unfold. And then something that's happening tomorrow that I think is really fascinating. I certainly wasn't expecting this, but I'm going to be tuning into it because it seems like it will be very interesting to follow. And this is the Vatican is releasing guidelines on Marian apparitions and the paranormal. So it's certainly raising some eyebrows in the UAP UFO community. Like, what's this about? And this seems a little bit maybe atypical. It's not that they don't release guidelines, it's just don't do it very often. So why now come out with this kind of information, and what will it contain? So I'm looking forward to seeing that. And Darren, I was dying to get your take on this. I mean, what is your feeling and sense of why the Vatican might be stepping forward with this kind of information at this juncture?
It's a good question. It's certainly a question that is being taken up across UFOX/UFO Twitter. You know, when we talked earlier about the different agencies and what is one agency going to jump and say we're going to be first here, I kind of want to point out there that I think one of the interesting things we'll see, and perhaps this speaks to what the Vatican is doing, is at some point you have this question that gets asked, posed as, do you want to be on the right side or the wrong side of history? So they have this certain point in time where for decades we have this control campaign to dismiss this topic, to cover it up. But eventually certain people, certain agencies even, certain public relations campaigns kind of people in those agencies begin to notice the winds of change. They begin to notice there's been a turn, and this is inevitably, whether it's 2 months from now, 2 years from now, there's going to be some sort of official disclosure. And when that happens, you kind of proactively want to get ahead of the curve and be the one to say that we actually were championing disclosure. We were one of the first ones to bring this forward. So that might be partly what is in the mixture, even in terms of the intergovernmental aspect that you talked to. There's not one monolithic government out there. There's these different agencies. It might be interesting to see, for instance, between the Navy and the Air Force, which one is going to come up first. We've seen the Navy seem to almost like point fingers at the Air Force saying, you are not playing nice with the expectations for being transparent about this. Who knows how that's going to happen? But I think we might see something where one agency kind of goes rogue and breaks out and says, we're going to take the bull by the horns. Now, in terms of the Vatican, yes. So first of all, we have to just say that eventually they do have to release some sort of updated guidelines. I think the last time I did it was the 70s or the 80s kind of thing. Pope John Paul, I think, was maybe the last one to do this. So it's been a while. Maybe it's overdue. And I think the primary concern is around, like what you talked about, Marian apparitions, the supernatural, right? How do we distinguish? What kind of criteria do we look for when we are confident to say this is supernatural, not just naturalistic? That's a whole interesting question in itself, because we've discussed on a previous episode the miracle at Fatima, quote unquote. And the Vatican, in that case, conducted a multi-year investigation and determined that was a legitimate Marian apparition, even though, as we pointed out in that episode, many ufologists would say not so fast, that looks like a traditional UFO kind of case fits within the phenomenon. So even when they want to come out and sound like they're being conservative, we still see, again, pre-existing worldviews that play into how people interpret these events. That said, I do think that there is a small elite at the Vatican that know a lot more about this topic than the public does, and perhaps even many governments do. There might be a small elite at the Vatican that understands this better than even the deeply Black programs do, because they have the historical archives to look at. The Vatican archives is this super secret basement place where people assume that all these secrets exist there. Certainly people like Diana Pasolka have pointed out that in her research, when you get past the interpretive layer and you actually look at what was described in terms of the testimony from some of those original people, it certainly looks like the same phenomenon, just interpreted differently over time. So, knowing that there is a small group at the Vatican who likely do understand that the orbs we're seeing today are very similar to the kind of phenomena that we're seeing in the past, we, of course, see many of these paintings that reflect saints with what look like UFOs in the background, or orbs or something like that. So again, we see evidence of this. I'm aware of situations where more modern experiencers that have experienced certain medical symptoms, there's been parallels drawn with people in the distant past, Christian past, who experienced something very similar, but without the modern understanding of science and medical understanding, it was diagnosed as something else. So stigmata might be something like that. St. Francis of Assisi might have experienced some symptoms that more recent experiencers have also experienced. Again, this is very, very interesting. So I think all that is to say, my guess is they do want to position themselves a little bit to be out ahead of this. In the same way we saw, a few years ago, the Vatican come out and say that we should welcome and expect that at some point we will find non-human intelligence in the cosmos somewhere, and they can find a place under the arms of Jesus just like everybody else. Right, so they were getting ahead of that. It's just a matter of when, not if. They're tuning into the changing of the winds, and they recognize that this is coming sooner than later. I think overarchingly, it's mostly going to be about this sort of spiritual, supernatural versus natural kind of criteria and clarification around that. But maybe it'll have enough nuance in there that maybe you could slot in how NHI might be reflected in that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the winds of change are definitely afoot. And I heard recently as well, someone posted on X that they had contacts that, and rumors they were hearing that China may even be close to disclosing. So I obviously don't know. I don't have any more detail than that, but it just, to me, is a signal, another signal in the noise that we're seeing that the dam is breaking, the front is changing. We're seeing different players, different factions coming forward and presenting aspects that relate to the core truth. Now, I said I wanted to get back to that, and we're near the end of the show, so I want to come back to this notion of the truth and notion of, what we're really trying to get at, what is really happening. And we've talked about, kind of the energy of this time. We talked about the various different events and perspectives about what the phenomenon might be. There's a strong thirst for getting to the truth as if it exists in this kind of very objective, I can hold it in my hands way. And I think, you and I take a different perspective on that to a certain degree, that the truth in some ways is kind of more malleable than it appears, that it's more complicated than it may seem, that it's dynamic almost like the truth is a living thing, that it's imbued with, different layers of meaning that correlate with one another. And that aspect of the truth is tapped into really all of our experience, just our basic lived experience of the world. And this gets into areas of synchronicity, which I know you touched on recently in your point of convergence episode. So all these things are tied together. What is it that's going on in this area of getting to the truth? How do we apply discernment to understand what that even means? Because I think my suspicion is we're going to be bombarded with more information than we can, reasonably parse. So how do we, take tools to bear to that, sea of information and make sense out of it?
It's a good question, and it's a challenging question to answer because there's so many aspects to it. To your earlier point, absolutely, I think we are finding, and even hints from quantum mechanical experiments are pointing in this direction, that reality is not this fixed thing that we can just tune it in with high-definition instruments and determine once and for all what it actually is. You find that the closer we look at the more micro level, the blurrier it gets, and the more that our observational capacity plays a role in what we see to begin with. So there's some sort of participatory nature to this, and I talked about this in the most recent POC episode. And partly what we might be seeing here is many things. I made this point as well, bringing up Bernardo Kastrup's point in that paper where he was making the argument that perhaps high strangeness is a different kind of phenomena than these craft and hangars and these bodies and freezers. And while we shouldn't jump to that conclusion that they are necessarily different, they might be different. And this adds to the mystery here because we have many different kinds of phenomena perhaps co-arising. And as I made the point in that POC episode, basically right now, anything that doesn't fit within reductionistic materialism gets tossed in as the same thing. And what we might be dealing with is multiple different things that stretch our understanding in multiple different ways, which is very, very interesting. So I also want to bring into the mix here, as if it wasn't complex enough already, that what we might be seeing in this seemingly penultimate moment in human history is that the structure of reality itself is changing. And it's not such a stretch when you think about the fact that if it's true that really what manifests as physical reality is just a collective collapsing of the waveform, so that basically how collective consciousness coheres around a certain vision of the world, that ends up being exactly what is produced in physical reality. And for a lot of reasons, both in physical and at deeper sort of energetic levels, it seems like the structure, the fabric of reality is going through some sort of metamorphosis in itself. So that gets interesting because as that veil thins, that's the expression people often use to describe what they're noticing, what they're sensing, then you might begin to notice multiple different realityscapes or dreamscapes, again, using the kind of idealism kind of language, bleeding in at the same time. So the same way that you have something like Skinwalker Ranch, where numerous different kind of phenomena that might have different origins, different natures, are coming through these portals. You leave the door open, who knows who might come through? It might be your next door neighbor, might be a bear, might be the ex-murderer that just wandered into town. So again, I think we jump the gun, only assume these are all somehow connected in terms of their nature, their intent, their agenda, and their origin even. In the same way that Skinwalker Ranch has these portals that leave open a door for these different kinds of beings from perhaps different kind of reality-scapes to come in, this thinning of the veil that's happening in our reality-scape might also be offering that up as a possibility, which is really interesting, but also really potentially overwhelming when you think about being a governmental body, trying to communicate that to the masses. How do you possibly do that? I would say, in final answer to your question, I don't think any of us know how this is going to go. And I don't know how you actually even have a disclosure plan where you can incorporate that much diversity and complexity around notions that there is no conventional understanding about to begin with. These are the times we're in.
Yeah, I've said this before, and I stand by it, that disclosure at its core is participatory, and it will be that way. There will be aspects that are released, and then everyone who's involved in hearing that and sharing that information is adding to what it really means, because it affects all of us, and its true effect on humanity remains to be seen. We really have to prepare in a way to digest that, to metabolize it, and we don't have a clear picture of what the outcome of that process will look like. At least I don't think we do. But I know that we all play a part in what it will be. And I think that that's the key, that it is participatory, that we share in the co-creation of the world alongside these other intelligences, alongside each other. We all play a part together in what it all means. And so it's just like a dream that you wake from and go, wow, like I had an incredible insight from that dream, even though it was completely bizarre, and trying to piece it together. And sometimes you revisit the dream weeks and months and years later, and it changes for you. You know, you think about, oh, well, and maybe it means this now. It's not that the dream had a concrete meaning at all. It's that it changed as you changed, and it changes the world around you in the process. So that's exactly what I think this is going to be like. I think it's a daunting task, but I do think it has to start somewhere, and that process is well underway. So on that note, I guess we'll conclude the show, and looking forward to having conversations with everyone, but also hoping that folks have a chance to step away from their daily routines and re-energize and come back to things with a rejuvenated sense of self and fresh perspective. Darren, anything else you want to add before we close?
The only piece I'll add, because there's always a little bit more complexity I like to add, but I think, again, this is on a positive note. And that's when we think about us being part of the co-authors of what is arising, what is cohering in our midst. I'll also point out that as we think about ourselves in opposition or being different than these others that are also in our midst, I would say that try to take this from the perspective of us being ourselves multidimensional beings expressed over numerous incarnations, prisming into these different iterations of ourselves. So again, one of the interesting aspects of the lore from experiencers, from abductees, is that they have a memory while on board a craft that they used to be a great alien, or in fact, sometimes they have this kind of dual soul conception. In a certain modality, they do identify as a great alien, other times as a human being. As much as that stretches our understanding, stretches the possibility scape, if reality is more like a dreamscape, and that it's, again, the stage step for the evolution of consciousness, I would just want to remind people of that, so that when things begin to get intense, because they will, I'm telling you it's coming, you were part of the process of being choosing to be here from the beginning. So think about the lessons to be learned while you're here, and that'll help us transition to whatever's coming.
Hear to that. Well, may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Phrames.